Sometimes life forces us to choose between saving someone we love and living with choices that haunt us forever. Caleb McKinnon thought he'd faced every hardship the Montana wilderness could throw at him, but nothing prepared him for this. A corrupt judge gave him an impossible choice: marry his sister Sarah or watch her hang. With her life in his hands, Caleb agreed. High in their mountain cabin, something unexpected began to grow between them. What started as desperate survival turned into a connection neither could deny. In the isolated wilderness where normal rules didn't apply, two hearts discovered that love sometimes finds a way, even in the darkest circumstances. But could forbidden love truly bloom where duty and survival demanded sacrifice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind cut through the valley like a sharpened blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter and the scent of dying leaves. Caleb McKinnon stood at the edge of his property, watching the last of the aspen trees surrender their golden crowns to the relentless Montana sky. At 34, he had spent the better part of 15 years calling these mountains home, and in all that time, he had never imagined his solitary existence would be shattered by something as simple as a piece of paper. The leather-bound journal tucked beneath his arm contained 15 years of careful observations, weather patterns, animal migrations, the best places to set traps when the snows came early. Every page documented his methodical approach to survival in a land that showed no mercy to the unprepared. But today, as he walked back toward the crude log cabin that had been his sanctuary, the journal felt heavier than usual, weighted down by the knowledge that his carefully ordered world was about to change forever. Sarah McKinnon, though she hadn't been a McKinnon by blood for 23 years, sat on the cabin's narrow porch, her fingers worrying the silver locket that had belonged to their mother. The locket was one of the few possessions she had been allowed to keep when Judge Blackwood's men had dragged her from her modest boarding house in Copper Creek, her hands still dusted with flour from the morning's baking. Inside the locket was a faded daguerreotype of Mary McKinnon, a woman whose gentle smile had been the one constant in both their lives before consumption claimed her when Sarah was barely 6 years old. "You're thinking too hard again," Sarah said without looking up as Caleb approached the porch. Her voice carried the soft accent of their childhood, though years of trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable in a world that seemed determined to crush young women who dared to live independently, had taught her to speak quietly. Caleb settled onto the porch step beside her, noting how she instinctively shifted to make room while maintaining careful distance. 3 days had passed since Judge Blackwood's grotesque ceremony in his chambers. 3 days since Caleb had signed papers that made Sarah his wife in the eyes of territorial law, and they were both still learning how to exist in the same space without acknowledging the impossibility of their situation. "Been thinking about winter," he said, which wasn't entirely a lie. The high meadows were already showing signs of frost, and if his calculations were correct, they had perhaps 6 weeks before the first serious snowfall would cut them off from the outside world completely. 6 weeks to figure out how two people who had once shared bedtime, stories and childhood secrets were supposed to navigate a marriage that existed only to keep one of them from the gallows. Sarah's fingers closed around the locket. Do you ever wonder what she would think of all this? Caleb didn't need to ask who she meant. Mary McKinnon had been the kind of woman who made everything seem possible, even in the hard-scrabble years after their father died in a mining accident. She had worked her fingers raw, taking in laundry and mending clothes for the miners, all while teaching both her children to read from the single book she owned, a collection of poems by William Blake that she claimed contained all the wisdom a person needed to understand the world. She'd probably quote Blake at us, Caleb said. And despite everything, Sarah almost smiled. Something about innocence and experience. How do you know but every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight closed by your senses 5? Sarah recited, her voice taking on the gentle cadence their mother had used during those long-ago evenings by the fire. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in memories of a woman whose greatest wish had been to see her children grow up safe and happy. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Sarah's safety now depended entirely on a legal arrangement that would have horrified Mary. McKinnon's deeply conventional sensibilities. Judge Horace Blackwood had been systematic in his corruption, a man who understood that power in the territories came not from elected office, but from controlling the flow of land and resources. For 3 years, he had been forcing homesteaders off their claims through a combination of trumped-up charges and strategic bankruptcies, selling the land to mining interests from back east for prices that made him richer than any territorial judge had a right to be. Sarah's crime had been witnessing one of these transactions. She had been delivering fresh bread to the territorial offices when she overheard Blackwood negotiating the sale of the Hendricks farm, the same farm where Mrs. Hendricks had been found dead just 2 days earlier, supposedly trampled by her own horses. Sarah's mistake had been mentioning what she heard to Mrs. Patterson at the general store, not realizing that Mrs. Patterson was Judge Blackwood's sister-in-law and primary source of information about local gossip. Within a week, Sarah found herself charged with theft, arson, and conspiracy, charges that Blackwood claimed were supported by credible witnesses who would testify that she had been seen near several properties that had mysteriously burned after their owners refused to sell. The evidence was manufactured, the witnesses were paid, and the outcome was predetermined. Sarah would hang, and her death would serve as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to interfere with Judge Blackwood's business arrangements. Except Caleb McKinnon wasn't the kind of man who accepted predetermined outcomes. He had ridden down from his mountain cabin with 2 things: his father's Colt Peacemaker and a leather pouch containing every piece of gold he had accumulated over 15 years of trapping. The gun was for Blackwood if he refused to listen to reason. The gold was for a different kind of negotiation. "You want the girl?" Blackwood had asked, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who knew he held all the cards. "Well, Mr. McKinnon, I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. The territorial law does provide for alternative sentences in certain cases. The alternative sentence turned out to be marriage. Not to Blackwood himself, even his corruption had limits, but to a member of her family, someone who could take responsibility for her future behavior and guarantee that she would never again interfere with legitimate business interests. The fact that Caleb was Sarah's brother was, in Blackwood's twisted logic, merely a detail. Territorial law was fluid on such matters, and who was to say what relationships were acceptable when survival was at stake? "You sign the papers, take her up to that mountain of yours, and keep her quiet," Blackwood had explained, with the casual air of a man discussing livestock. "She stays quiet, she stays alive. She causes me any more trouble, and I'll find a way to bring her back down here and finish what I started. Are we clear?" Caleb had signed the papers. Now 3 days later, they were learning to live with the consequences. The cabin that had been built for one was cramped with 2, especially when those 2 were trying to maintain careful boundaries around something that had no clear boundaries to begin with. Sarah had taken the small alcove where Caleb usually stored his trapping supplies, hanging a blanket across the opening for privacy. Caleb slept on the main room floor near the fireplace, telling himself it was practical. Someone needed to tend the fire through the night. During the day, they moved around each other with the careful choreography of people who had learned to read each other's moods through years of shared experiences, but who were now navigating entirely new terrain. Sarah proved herself surprisingly capable at the tasks that mountain living required. She learned to split kindling without asking for help, could start a fire in the rain, and had an intuitive understanding of which plants could be safely eaten and which should be avoided. "You remember more than I thought you would," Caleb had said that morning, watching her efficiently clean the rabbits he had trapped the night before. "Ma taught me things," Sarah replied, her hands steady as she worked. "She said a woman needed to know how to take care of herself, no matter what life handed her." Mary McKinnon had been practical above all else, understanding that the frontier was no place for helpless women. She had taught Sarah to shoot, to hunt, to read weather patterns and animal behavior, but she had also taught her that there were rules, moral boundaries that separated civilized people from the animals they hunted. Neither Sarah nor Caleb spoke about how those rules applied to their current situation. The evenings were the hardest. With the work done and darkness settling over the valley, there was nothing to do but sit by the fire and pretend that the weight of unspoken thoughts wasn't pressing down on them like the mountain air itself. They talked about practical things, supplies they would need before winter, repairs that should be made to the cabin's roof, the best places to set trap lines when the snow came. They didn't talk about the way Sarah's presence had changed everything about the space, how the cabin no longer felt like a refuge, but like a test of endurance. They didn't talk about the dreams that left them both restless and ashamed, or the moments when their eyes would meet across the room, and something would pass between them that had nothing to do with shared childhood memories. On the third evening, as Sarah mended a tear in one of his shirts by firelight, Caleb found himself watching the way the flames cast shadows across her face, and realized that somewhere, in the years since he had last seen her, little Sarah McKinnon had become a woman whose strength ran deeper than the mountain streams, and whose quiet grace could break a man's heart without her even knowing she was doing it. The realization terrified him more than any blizzard or grizzly bear ever had, because it suggested that Judge Blackwood's twisted punishment might be leading them somewhere they could never come back from. The wedding ceremony had been a mockery of everything sacred, conducted in Judge Blackwood's private chambers with only his clerk as witness. The wedding certificate lay folded in Sarah's carpet bag now, a crude document hastily scrawled on official territorial letterhead that legally bound her to the man who had been her protector, her brother, her only family for as long as she could remember. "Do you, Caleb McKinnon, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Blackwood had intoned with barely concealed amusement, as if the whole proceeding was an elaborate joke designed for his personal entertainment. Caleb's "I do" had come out rough and strained, his eyes fixed on Sarah's pale face rather than the judge who held her life in his corrupt hands. Sarah's own response had been barely audible, a whisper that seemed to take every ounce of strength she possessed. "Then by the power vested in me, by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Blackwood had smiled then, a cold expression that never touched his eyes. "You may kiss the bride, Mr. McKinnon." That moment stretched between them like a chasm. Caleb had leaned forward slowly, his calloused hands gentle as they cupped Sarah's face, and pressed his lips to her forehead instead, a gesture that spoke of protection rather than passion, of desperate love for family rather than the romantic union the ceremony was meant to represent. The ride up to the cabin had taken most of the day, Sarah's bay mare following Caleb's gelding along familiar mountain trails that seemed different now, charged with new meaning. They had traveled these same paths as children, racing their horses through summer meadows and sharing stories by creek beds where the water ran so clear you could count the stones on the bottom. Now each bend in the trail brought them closer to a future neither of them understood. "I can sleep in the stable," Caleb had said when they finally reached the cabin as sunset painted the peaks crimson and gold. "Don't be foolish," Sarah had replied, though her voice shook slightly. "It's going to snow soon." "I can see it in the clouds." She was right, of course. The air carried that particular bite that came before the first real snowfall, and the animals were already showing signs of preparing for winter. But practical considerations seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what they were both avoiding. The simple fact that married people were expected to share more than just a roof. That first night, they had maintained an awkward distance, Sarah retreating to her makeshift alcove, while Caleb settled by the fire with his journal and the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. The journal entries from that evening were brief and factual. Temperature dropping. Check trap lines tomorrow. Sarah safe. But safety, Caleb was beginning to understand, was more complicated than simply keeping someone alive. The nightmares started the second night. Sarah's cries in the darkness brought Caleb to his feet instantly, his hand reaching for the rifle that hung above the mantel before he fully understood what he was hearing. Not danger from outside the cabin, but the demons that lived inside Sarah's mind, the terror of those weeks in Blackwood's makeshift jail, the certainty that she was going to die for crimes she had never committed. Sarah. He spoke her name softly through the blanket that separated her sleeping area from the main room. "You're safe now." "You're safe." The crying stopped, replaced by the sound of harsh breathing and the rustle of blankets. "I dreamed I was back in that cell," she said finally, her voice small and lost in the darkness. "I could smell the mold on the walls and hear them building the gallows outside my window." Caleb's fists clenched at the image. He had seen Blackwood's jail, a converted root cellar beneath the territorial office building where prisoners were kept in conditions that wouldn't be considered acceptable for livestock. The fact that Sarah had survived 3 weeks in that place without losing her mind entirely was testament to a strength he was only beginning to appreciate. "That's over now," he said, moving closer to the blanket barrier, but not crossing it. "Blackwood can't touch you here, can't he?" Sarah's question carried a weight that made Caleb's chest tighten. "We're not really married, Caleb, not in any way that matters." What happens when he decides this arrangement isn't entertaining anymore? What happens when someone notices that we're... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence that hung between them like smoke. What happens when someone notices that we're brother and sister? The question she couldn't voice was the one that haunted them both, because territorial law was fluid and justice was whatever men like Blackwood decided it should be. Today their marriage was legal because it suited his purposes. Tomorrow it might become grounds for charges that would see them both hanged. "Then we'll face it when it comes," Caleb said finally. "But right now, tonight, you're safe. That's what matters." The third night brought another nightmare, and this time Caleb didn't hesitate. When Sarah's cries pierced the darkness, he pushed through the blanket and knelt beside her narrow cot, his hands gentle on her shoulders as she fought against dreams that tried to drag her back to that terrible place. "I'm here," he whispered, and Sarah's eyes opened, wild with terror before recognition settled in. Without thinking, without questioning the rightness or wrongness of it, she reached for him, her arms encircling his neck as she buried her face against his shoulder. Caleb held her while she trembled, one hand smoothing her dark hair while the other rubbed gentle circles on her back. She smelled like lavender soap and wood smoke, familiar scents from their childhood that now seemed charged with dangerous possibilities. Her body was warm against his, soft where his was hard, curved where his was angular. He tried not to notice these things, tried to focus on the practical matter of offering comfort to someone who had endured more than any person should have to bear, but Sarah was no longer the little girl who had once crawled into his bed during thunderstorms. She was a woman and he was a man, and the line between protective comfort and something else entirely was thinner than either of them wanted to acknowledge. "I keep thinking about Ma," Sarah whispered against his shoulder. "About what she would say if she could see us now." Caleb's hand stilled in her hair. Mary McKinnon had been a woman of unwavering moral convictions, someone who believed that right and wrong were clearly defined and that good people always chose the right path, regardless of the consequences. She had raised them both to understand that family bonds were sacred, that the love between siblings was pure and protective and never to be confused with other kinds of love. She would say, "We did what we had to do to survive," Caleb said, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. Would she? Sarah pulled back to look at him, her eyes reflecting the dying firelight from the main room. Or would she say that some things are worse than dying? The question hung between them, unanswerable and terrible. Caleb wanted to reassure her, to promise that their mother would have understood, would have approved of the choice they had made. But honesty had always been the foundation of their relationship, and he couldn't lie to her now, not when everything else in their world had become uncertain. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know she would want you to live. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, she would want you to live." Sarah's hand came up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a tenderness that made his breath catch. "And what do you want, Caleb?" The question was innocent and loaded with meaning at the same time. What did he want? To turn back time, to find a way to save Sarah that didn't require them to navigate this impossible situation, to wake up and discover that the last 4 days had been nothing more than a fever dream. Or, and this was the thought that terrified him most, did he want to stop pretending? That holding her felt like coming home in a way that had nothing to do with childhood memories and everything to do with the woman she had become? "I want you to be safe," he said finally, which was true but not the whole truth. Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. "That's not what I asked." But it was all the answer he could give her, at least for now. The cabin suddenly felt too small, the air too thin, charged with possibilities that neither of them was ready to examine too closely. Caleb pulled away gently, his hands lingering on her shoulders for just a moment longer than necessary. "Try to get some sleep," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Tomorrow we need to check the trap lines before the weather turns." As he returned to his place by the fire, Caleb tried to convince himself that what had just passed between them was nothing more than the natural result of two people thrown together by circumstances beyond their control. But the warmth of Sarah's body against his lingered, and the memory of her fingers on his face made it impossible to find the sleep that had been eluding him for 3 nights running. The hand-carved chess set had been one of Caleb's winter projects 3 years ago, born from the kind of restless energy that came from being snowed in for weeks at a time, with nothing but books and firelight for company. He had carved the pieces from different woods, pine for the pawns, oak for the larger pieces, with careful attention to detail that spoke of long, patient hours spent perfecting each curve and angle. The set sat on a small table near the fireplace now, a ritual that had developed naturally over their first week together. After the day's work was done and their simple supper cleaned away, Sarah would set up the board while Caleb banked the fire for the night. Their games had become a way to fill the dangerous quiet hours when conversation might stray into territory neither of them was ready to explore. "Your move," Sarah said, studying the board with the kind of focused attention that still surprised Caleb. He had taught her the basics of chess when she was 12, but her strategic thinking had developed far beyond what he remembered from their childhood games. Caleb moved his knight, watching as Sarah immediately saw the trap he was trying to set and countered it with a move that put his king in subtle danger 3 turns down the line. "Where did you learn to play like this?" "Mrs. Carmichael at the boarding house," Sarah replied, moving her bishop with quiet confidence. She was a retired teacher from Boston. "Said chess was good for developing the mind." She paused, her fingers still touching the piece. "She was the one who encouraged me to start the bakery business. Said women needed to learn to stand on their own." It was the most Sarah had spoken about her life in Copper Creek since their wedding, and Caleb found himself hungry for these small details. For 8 years, she had been little more than a memory to him, the bright-eyed girl who had waved goodbye when he left for the mountains, promising to visit soon. The woman sitting across from him was a stranger in many ways, shaped by experiences he had no part in. "What was it like?" he asked carefully. "Living in town, I mean." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Lonely," she said simply. "Everyone was polite enough, but I was an unmarried woman running her own business. That made me suspicious to the wives and dangerous to the unmarried men. Mrs. Patterson was the only one who seemed to want my company, and we know how that turned out. The bitter irony wasn't lost on either of them. Sarah's one attempt at friendship had been the very thing that put her life in danger. Mrs. Patterson's casual gossip to her brother-in-law had set in motion the chain of events that led them. "Here, I'm sorry," Caleb said, meaning it in ways that went deeper than simple sympathy. "Don't be." Sarah moved her queen, putting his king in check with a move he hadn't seen coming. "If none of it had happened, I'd still be in that tiny room above the bakery, going to bed every night wondering if this was all my life was going to be." Caleb studied her face in the firelight, trying to read the emotion behind her words. "And now I don't know what my life is going to be," she said, meeting his eyes across the chessboard. "But at least I'm not alone." The weight of that simple statement settled between them, like a stone dropping into still water. Not alone. It was such a modest thing to be grateful for, and yet Caleb understood exactly what she meant. His own years of solitude had taught him the particular ache of having no one to share the small moments with, the first snow of the season, the way morning light painted the mountain peaks, the satisfaction of a successful hunt. "Check," Sarah said softly, and Caleb realized he had been so lost in thought that he'd missed her move entirely. The next morning brought their first real test of working together. The trap lines needed to be checked before the weather turned, and Caleb had initially planned to leave Sarah at the cabin while he made the rounds alone. But Sarah had other ideas. "I'm coming with you," she announced over breakfast, her tone brooking no argument. "It's a full day's ride," Caleb protested. "The trails are rough, and if we run into weather, then you'll need someone watching your back," Sarah interrupted. "Besides, I need to learn these trails if I'm going to survive up here." She was right, though Caleb was reluctant to admit it. If something happened to him, injury, illness, or worse, Sarah would need to know how to navigate the mountain trails to get help or supplies. The mountains were unforgiving to those who didn't understand their moods and dangers. They set out just after dawn. Sarah mounted on the bay mare she had ridden up from town. Caleb on his sturdy mountain horse that had carried him safely through 8 years of wilderness living. The morning was crisp and clear, with that particular quality of light that came just before winter settled in for good. Sarah proved to be a capable rider, handling her horse with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up around animals. She had braided her dark hair back and wore a practical split skirt that allowed her to sit astride rather than side saddle, a choice that would have scandalized the ladies of Copper Creek, but which made perfect sense in the mountains. "Tell me about the traps," she said as they rode single file up a narrow trail that hugged the mountainside. Caleb found himself falling into the role of teacher, explaining how to read animal signs, where to set traps for maximum effectiveness, and how to check them safely. Sarah listened with the kind of focused attention that reminded him of their mother, asking intelligent questions that showed she was thinking beyond just memorizing his instructions. At the first trap site, Caleb demonstrated the proper technique for approaching and checking the trap, conscious of Sarah watching his every move. The trap was empty, but the signs around it suggested that animals were using the trail regularly. "Your turn," he said at the second site, staying close enough to intervene if necessary, but giving Sarah room to work. She approached the trap with careful deliberation, reading the signs just as he had taught her, checking for disturbance in the surrounding area before examining the trap itself. This one held a rabbit, and Sarah's face went pale for a moment before she steadied herself and completed the task with gentle efficiency. "It gets easier," Caleb said quietly, understanding the conflict between practical necessity and natural compassion. "Does it?" Sarah asked, cradling the rabbit with unexpected tenderness. "Or do you just learn not to think about it?" "Both, maybe," Caleb admitted. "But there's honor in using what the mountain provides. Nothing gets wasted." By midday, they had checked half the trap line and shared a simple meal of bread and dried meat beside a stream that sang with the voice of snowmelt and autumn rain. Sarah sat on a fallen log, her face turned toward the weak sun, and Caleb found himself studying the elegant line of her profile. The way the light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair. "It's beautiful up here," she said without opening her eyes. "I'd forgotten how quiet it could be." "Quiet's not the same as silent," Caleb observed. "Listen." Sarah tilted her head, and gradually the sounds of the mountains revealed themselves, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant cry of a hawk, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. It was a symphony that most people never learned to hear, but Sarah had always been sensitive to such things. "I miss this," she said finally. In town there was always noise. Wagons, people shouting, the sound of the mill running day and night. I forgot what it was like to hear the world breathing. That afternoon, as they finished checking the remaining traps, Caleb realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. Working together, sharing knowledge and responsibility, had created a partnership that went beyond their forced legal arrangement. They moved with increasing synchronization, Sarah anticipating what he needed before he asked, Caleb adjusting his explanations to match her quick understanding. As they rode back toward the cabin with the day's catch secured to their saddles, Caleb found himself wondering if this was what marriage was supposed to feel like. Not the grand romance of penny novels, but this quiet compatibility, this sense of having found someone who understood the rhythm of your days and wanted to share them. Sarah's sewing kit was a small thing, a wooden box no bigger than a prayer book, containing spools of thread in various colors, needles of different sizes, and a pair of tiny scissors that had belonged to their mother. She had carried it with her from the boarding house, one of the few personal possessions Judge Blackwood had allowed her to keep when his men arrested her. Now it sat open on the table beside the chess set, Sarah's slender fingers working with practiced precision as she mended a tear in Caleb's favorite shirt, the one he'd snagged on a branch while checking the trap lines 2 days earlier. The fabric was worn soft from years of use, and she worked carefully to ensure the repair would be strong enough to last through the winter months ahead. "You don't have to do that," Caleb said from his position by the fireplace, where he was cleaning his rifle with the methodical attention of a man who understood that his life might depend on the weapon's reliability. "I know," Sarah replied without looking up from her work, "but it needs doing and I'm good at it." The simple statement carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Since their marriage, they had been finding their way toward a division of labor that played to their respective strengths. Caleb handled the hunting, trapping, and heavy maintenance work that mountain living required. Sarah had taken over the cooking, mending, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept their domestic life running smoothly. It should have felt natural, traditional even. Instead, it felt like they were playing house, two people pretending to be something they weren't, while trying to ignore the growing awareness that sparkled between them like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Tell me about the war," Sarah said suddenly, her needle pausing in its work, Caleb's hands stilled on the rifle. He had served 3 years in the Union Army, fighting in battles whose names had become history, but whose memories still haunted his sleep. It wasn't something he talked about, not even with other men who had shared similar experiences. "Why do you want to know?" Sarah set down her sewing and met his eyes across the room. "Because you have scars that weren't there when you left home. Because sometimes you wake up in the night and I can hear you pacing by the fire. Because I want to understand what shaped you into the man you are now." The honesty in her voice broke through his usual defenses. She wasn't asking out of idle curiosity, but from a genuine desire to know him. Not the boy she remembered from their childhood, but the man he had become through experiences that had nothing to do with their shared past. "It was ugly," he said finally, returning his attention to the rifle. "Not the glorious cause they made it out to be when we enlisted. Just men killing other men for reasons that stopped making sense somewhere around the 2nd year. Is that why you came up here? To get away from all that?" Caleb nodded slowly. "The mountains don't lie to you. They're dangerous, but they're honest about it. A blizzard doesn't pretend to be your friend while it freezes you to death." Sarah resumed her sewing, but Caleb could feel her attention still focused on him. What was the worst of it? The question hung in the air like smoke. Caleb found himself remembering things he had spent 8 years trying to forget. The sound of cannon fire, the smell of blood and gunpowder, the faces of boys who had died far from home under skies that didn't care about their hopes or fears. Shiloh, he said quietly. April of 62. We went into that battle thinking we understood what war was. Came out knowing we didn't understand anything at all. He told her about the morning when the Confederate forces had surprised them at dawn, about the chaos and confusion that had followed, about spending 2 days fighting over ground that changed hands so many times that nobody knew who controlled what. He told her about the friends he had lost, about the wound that had left the long scar running from his left shoulder down to his elbow, about the night after the battle when the surviving soldiers from both sides had worked together to carry the wounded to safety. That's when I knew I was done with causes, he concluded. When you're carrying a dying Confederate boy because he's crying for his mother, and you realize he's the same age as your little sister, causes stop meaning much. Sarah had finished mending his shirt while he talked, but she continued to hold it in her hands, her fingers smoothing the fabric with unconscious tenderness. Is that what I am to you? She asked softly. Your little sister? The question cut through the careful distance they had been maintaining like a knife through silk. Caleb looked up from his rifle to find Sarah watching him with an expression that was anything but sisterly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, her lips slightly parted, her whole being focused on his answer with an intensity that made his chest tighten. I don't know what you are to me, he admitted, the words coming out rough and honest. I thought I did, but nothing about this situation makes sense anymore. Sarah set the mended shirt aside and rose from her chair, moving toward him with the fluid grace that had been catching his attention more and more frequently. She knelt beside him on the floor, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, close enough that he could see the pulse beating at the base of her throat. Show me, she said. Reaching for his left arm, Caleb started to pull away, but her touch was gentle, insistent. She pushed up the sleeve of his shirt, revealing the long, puckered scar that marked where Confederate shrapnel had torn through muscle and sinew. Her fingers traced the length of it with a tenderness that made him shiver. Does it still hurt? Sometimes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. When the weather's changing. Sarah's fingers continued their exploration, moving from the scar to the network of smaller marks that spoke of other battles, other close calls. Each touch sent fire through his veins, awakening responses he had been trying to suppress since the night she had reached for him during her nightmare. And this one. Her fingertip found a circular scar on his forearm where a musket ball had grazed him at Antietam. Barely felt it at the time, Caleb managed, though her gentle ministrations were making it difficult to think clearly. Adrenaline, I suppose. Sarah's hand moved higher, pushing the shirt up to reveal more scars, each one a story he had never shared with anyone. Her touch was clinical at first, examining each mark with the focused attention of someone trying to understand. But gradually it became something else, a caress, an acknowledgement, a form of healing he hadn't known he needed. You've carried all of this alone, she said, her voice thick with emotion. It was my burden to carry, not anymore. Sarah's hands came up to frame his face, her thumbs brushing across his cheekbones with a tenderness that took his breath away. You don't have to be alone anymore, Caleb. The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. Caleb could see the gold flecks in Sarah's brown eyes, could count the freckles scattered across her nose like autumn leaves. Her breath was warm against his face, sweet with the mint tea she favored in the evenings. Sarah, he whispered, her name both a prayer and a warning. I know, she said softly. I know what this means. I know what we're risking, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her forehead coming to rest against his, their breathing mingling in the small space between them. They stayed like that for a long moment, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything, both of them afraid to move forward and unable to step back. It was Sarah who finally broke the spell, pulling away with visible effort and returning to her chair by the table. She picked up her sewing kit with hands that trembled slightly, her movements careful and deliberate as she put each item back in its proper place. We should get some sleep, she said without looking at him. Tomorrow, we need to start preparing for winter in earnest. Caleb nodded, though his body was still humming with unfulfilled desire, and his mind was reeling from what had almost happened between them. As he watched Sarah retreat to her alcove, he realized that the careful boundaries they had established were crumbling faster than either of them had anticipated. The mountains might be honest in their dangers, but the human heart, he was discovering, was far more treacherous territory to navigate. Caleb's father's rifle was a Winchester 73, a lever-action beauty that had served Thomas McKinnon faithfully through his own struggles to carve out a life in the unforgiving Montana Territory. The weapon had passed to Caleb after his father's death in the mining accident, along with the responsibility of caring for his family and the hard-earned knowledge of what it took to survive when civilization was just a distant memory. Now, as he watched Sarah shoulder the rifle with natural grace, adjusting her stance according to his quiet corrections, Caleb found himself thinking about legacy and the strange ways that life could circle back on itself. His father had taught him to shoot on mornings just like this one, with frost painting the meadow grass silver and the air so clear that distant peaks seemed close enough to touch. "Breathe in, let half of it out, then hold," he murmured, standing close behind Sarah to guide her aim toward the target he had set up 50 yards away, a piece of bark with a charcoal circle drawn on it. "Squeeze the trigger like you're trying not to wake a sleeping baby." Sarah's body was tense with concentration, her dark hair escaping from its braid to curl around her face in the morning breeze. Caleb could feel the warmth radiating from her skin through the layers of practical clothing she wore, could smell the faint lavender scent that seemed to follow her everywhere. Standing this close to her, with his hands covering hers on the rifle stock, felt both natural and dangerous. "I can't hold it steady," Sarah said, frustration creeping into her voice as the rifle wavered slightly. "Here," Caleb said, moving even closer, his chest nearly touching her back as he helped support the weight of the weapon. "Let me help you find your balance." The moment their bodies made contact, something electric passed between them, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with shooting lessons and everything to do with the growing tension that had been building between them for weeks. Sarah's breath caught audibly, and Caleb felt her lean back against him just slightly, as if seeking more of the connection. "Focus on the target," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Sarah nodded, but he could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse against his forearm, where it crossed her collarbone. When she squeezed the trigger, the shot went wide, the bullet embedding itself in a pine tree several feet to the left of their improvised target. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to lower the rifle. "Don't be. Try again." They repeated the process, Caleb's patient instruction gradually helping Sarah find her rhythm with the unfamiliar weapon. With each shot her accuracy improved, but more significantly, the physical closeness required for the lesson was breaking down the careful barriers they had constructed around their growing attraction. "Better," Caleb said after Sarah managed to hit the outer edge of the target. "You're a natural at this." Sarah turned in his arms to face him, the rifle forgotten between them. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold air and exertion, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of accomplishment. "Ma always said I had steady hands." The mention of their mother should have been a reminder of the boundaries they were crossing, but instead it felt like an acknowledgement of shared history, of the bonds that tied them together in ways that went deeper than their current circumstances. Mary McKinnon had taught them both to shoot, had believed that everyone should know how to protect themselves and provide for their families. "She'd be proud of you," Caleb said softly, his hands still resting on Sarah's shoulders from the shooting lesson. Would she? Sarah's question carried the weight of all the doubts that haunted them both. Or would she be horrified by what we've become? The question hung between them in the crystalline morning air. Caleb found himself studying Sarah's face, the familiar features that echoed their shared childhood, transformed now by the experiences that had shaped her into the remarkable woman standing before him. She was no longer the little girl who had needed his protection. She was his equal in strength and determination, his match in intelligence and courage. "I think," he said carefully. She would understand that sometimes people have to make impossible choices to survive. Sarah's laugh held no humor. Is that what this is? Survival. Before Caleb could answer, Sarah reached up and touched his face with fingers that trembled slightly from cold, and something else entirely. Her palm was warm against his cheek, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw with a tenderness that made his heart race. Because it doesn't feel like survival anymore, she whispered. It feels like she never finished the sentence. Instead, she rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his, cutting off his words and his ability to think rationally. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if she was giving him the chance to pull away, to remind them both of all the reasons why this was impossible. But Caleb didn't pull away. Instead, he dropped the rifle to the ground and gathered Sarah closer, his arms encircling her waist as he deepened the kiss with 8 years of loneliness and need behind it. She tasted like the mint tea she had drunk with breakfast and something sweeter, something uniquely Sarah that he had been trying not to notice for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah's eyes were wide with wonder and fear. "Oh," she breathed, her fingers still tangled in his shirt front. "Sarah," Caleb began, but she silenced him with another kiss. This one more confident, more sure of what she wanted. When they separated this time, the world around them seemed to have shifted on its axis. The mountains were the same. The morning sun still painted everything in shades of gold and amber, but something fundamental had changed between them. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, acknowledged feelings that could never again be denied. "We can't," Caleb said, though his arms remained around her, holding her close against his chest. "Why not?" Sarah's question was simple and devastating. "Because of what people might say. Because of laws written by men like Judge Blackwood. Because of rules that were made by people who never had to face the choices we're facing. Because you're my sister," Caleb said, the words feeling false even as he spoke them. Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. "Am I? We share no blood, Caleb. We were raised in the same house, but that doesn't make us family in the way that matters for this. And even if it did," she paused, her hand over his heart, feeling its rapid beat. "Even if it did, I would rather spend one honest day loving you than a lifetime pretending these feelings don't exist." The honesty in her words broke something loose in Caleb's chest. Some carefully constructed wall that had been holding back months of suppressed longing. He had been telling himself that his growing feelings for Sarah were wrong, immoral, a betrayal of everything he had been taught about family and proper behavior. But looking into her eyes now, seeing her own feelings reflected there, he realized that the only betrayal would be denying what had grown between them. "If we do this," he said quietly, "there's no going back. We'll be choosing each other over everything else, over what people expect, over what's considered proper, over any chance of a normal life." "Normal," Sarah repeated, as if testing the word. "When has our life ever been normal, Caleb? When have we ever had the luxury of caring what other people think?" She had a point. They had been living outside the boundaries of normal society since the day Judge Blackwood had forced them into this arrangement. Their marriage was already a scandal by conventional standards, two people bound together not by love but by legal necessity, isolated from the judgment of others by geography and circumstance. "Then we choose each other," Caleb said, the decision crystallizing in his mind even as the words left his lips. Sarah's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy and relief. "We choose each other," she agreed, and when she kissed him this time, it was with the certainty of a woman who had found her heart's desire in the most unexpected place. The rifle lay forgotten in the frost-covered grass as they held each other in the golden morning light. Two souls who had discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most impossible circumstances. The mountains stood witness to their choice, ancient and enduring, keeping their secrets as they had kept the secrets of countless others who had sought refuge in their hidden valleys. But even as Caleb lost himself in the sweetness of Sarah's kiss, a part of his mind was already racing ahead to the challenges that lay before them. They might have chosen each other, but the world outside their mountain sanctuary had its own ideas about what was acceptable and what was not. Judge Blackwood still held power over their lives, and their legal situation remained as precarious as ever. For now, though, none of that mattered. What mattered was the woman in his arms, the taste of her lips, and the knowledge that they had finally stopped, fighting the feelings that had been growing between them since that first night. When she had reached for him in the darkness, the future would bring its own complications, but in this moment, surrounded by the eternal silence of the mountains and the promise of winter in the air, they were simply two people who had found love in the most unlikely of places. The medicine bundle hung from a peg beside the fireplace, a leather pouch containing herbs and remedies that Caleb had learned from an old Crow medicine man during his second winter in the mountains. Inside were willow bark for pain, echinacea for fighting infection, and a dozen other plants that could mean the difference between life and death when the nearest doctor was a 3-day ride through treacherous terrain. Sarah discovered its importance when she woke on a November morning burning with fever, her body racked with chills that made her teeth chatter despite the warm fire Caleb kept burning day and night. The illness had come on suddenly. The night before she had been fine, laughing at something he said over their evening chess game. Now she lay in her makeshift bed, her skin pale and clammy, her breathing shallow and labored. "It's just a cold," she insisted weakly when Caleb knelt beside her with worry etched deep in his face. "I'll be fine by tomorrow." But Caleb had seen enough sickness in the war and in the mountains to recognize when someone was seriously ill. Sarah's fever was high enough to be dangerous, and the congestion in her chest suggested something more serious than a simple cold. Without proper medicine, without a doctor's care, she could easily take a turn for the worse. "Stay still," he commanded gently, his hands surprisingly tender as he checked her pulse and felt the heat radiating from her skin. "I'm going to take care of you." What followed were 3 days that tested every skill Caleb had learned about healing and every emotion he had been trying to keep in check. He brewed willow bark tea to bring down her fever, made poultices of herbs to ease her congestion, and sat by her bedside through the long hours when her fever spiked and she mumbled deliriously about things from their childhood, their mother's songs, the games they had played in the meadows below the cabin, the promises they had made to always take care of each other. On the second night, when Sarah's fever reached its peak and she began shivering so violently that the entire cot shook, Caleb made a decision that went beyond medical necessity. He stripped down to his long underwear and climbed into the narrow bed beside her, pulling her against his chest and wrapping them both in every blanket they owned. Body heat, he told himself, though the rationalization felt thin even to his own mind. She needs warmth. Sarah was barely conscious, but she turned toward him instinctively, seeking the comfort of human contact in her delirium. Her body was furnace hot against his, her breathing harsh and uneven, and Caleb held her through the long night hours, whispering reassurances when she cried out and stroking her hair when she finally fell into restless sleep. By morning, her fever had broken, leaving her weak but lucid. She woke to find herself pressed against Caleb's chest, his arm protectively encircling her waist, his face peaceful in sleep. For a moment she simply lay there, absorbing the warmth and safety of his embrace, remembering fragments of the night before, his gentle hands cooling her fevered skin with damp cloths, his voice talking her through the worst of the chills, the solid reassurance of his presence when she had been lost in fever dreams. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice hoarse from illness. His eyes opened immediately, alert and focused despite having had little sleep. "How do you feel?" "Better," she said truthfully, though she made no move to pull away from him. "Thanks to you." Caleb's hand came up to touch her forehead, checking for signs that the fever might return. His touch was clinical, but Sarah could see something deeper in his eyes, relief, tenderness, and an emotion that made her heart race despite her weakness. "You scared me," he admitted quietly. "I thought I might lose you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning that went far beyond concern for a family member. Sarah reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "You wouldn't lose me," she said softly. "Not now. Not when we've just found each other." The kiss that followed was different from the one they had shared during the shooting lesson. Deeper, more certain, colored by the knowledge of how precious and fragile their time together might be. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, the boundaries that had existed between them seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. "I love you," Sarah said, the words coming out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for too long. "I know it's impossible and wrong, and all the things we've been telling ourselves. But I love you, Caleb, not as a sister loves a brother, but as a woman loves a man." Caleb's response was to kiss her again, pouring 8 years of loneliness and weeks of growing desire into the connection between them. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God help us both, but I love you too." The admission broke down the last of their resistance. That afternoon, as Sarah's strength returned and the cabin filled with the warm light of late autumn sun, they talked with the honesty of people who had nothing left to lose. They spoke of their childhood together, of the years they had spent apart, of the dreams they had harbored, and the futures they had imagined before fate had brought them to this impossible place. "Do you ever wonder?" Sarah asked as they sat together on the narrow cot, her head resting against Caleb's shoulder. "What would have happened if we had met as strangers, if we didn't have all this history between us?" Caleb considered the question, his fingers absently stroking her hair. "I think I would have fallen in love with you even faster," he said finally. "But I also think it wouldn't have meant as much. What we have, it's built on more than just attraction. It's built on knowing each other completely, on sharing a history that goes back to the beginning of our conscious lives." Sarah tilted her head to look at him. "And that makes it more real?" "It makes it more honest," Caleb replied. "We're not falling in love with idealized versions of each other. We know each other's flaws, each other's fears. We've seen each other at our worst and our best." That night, they made love for the first time, not with the desperate passion of lovers stealing forbidden moments, but with the tender intensity of two people who had finally stopped fighting their deepest truth. Their joining was gentle and reverent, a consecration of feelings that had been growing in secret for weeks. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts their mother had made, Sarah traced patterns on Caleb's chest with her fingertip. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we figure out how to build a life together," Caleb said, his arms tightening around her. "We've got winter to ourselves, time to decide what we want our future to look like, and if the outside world won't accept what we've chosen." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Then we make our own world," he said finally. "We've got the mountains, each other, and skills enough to survive whatever comes." "That might have to be enough," Sarah smiled against his skin. "It already is enough," she said. "Whatever else happens, we have this. We have each other." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, transforming the world into something clean and new. Inside the cabin, two hearts that had found their home in each other settled into the rhythm of a love that defied convention but felt as natural as breathing. They had chosen each other despite everything that stood against them, and in making that choice, they had discovered that sometimes the most impossible love stories were also the most true. The adoption papers were tucked between the pages of Sarah's well-worn copy of Blake's poems, the same book their mother had read to them countless evenings by the fire. Sarah had been looking for a particular verse, something about innocence and experience that seemed relevant to their situation. When the folded documents fluttered to the floor, like autumn leaves disturbed by an unexpected wind, Caleb was mending a harness by the fire. When he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, he looked up to see her standing frozen beside the small table, her face pale as winter snow, the book forgotten in her hands as she stared at the papers scattered at her feet. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside his work and moving toward her with the quick, efficient steps of a man accustomed to responding to crisis. Sarah's hands trembled as she knelt to gather the documents, her movements slow and careful, as if she was afraid the papers might crumble at her touch. I had forgotten these were here," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Caleb knelt beside her, studying the official seals and formal script that marked the documents as legal papers of some kind. The heading at the top of the first page made his breath catch. Certificate of Adoption, Territory of Montana. "Sarah, what are these?" "Read them," she said, pressing the papers into his hands with fingers that shook like aspen leaves in a high wind. "Just read them and tell me I'm not dreaming." Caleb took the documents with growing bewilderment, his eyes scanning the formal language that seemed to blur and swim before him as he tried to process what he was seeing. The papers were dated 23 years earlier, signed by territorial officials he didn't recognize and witnessed by people whose names meant nothing to him. But one name leaped out at him with devastating clarity: Sarah Elizabeth Winters. Born June 15, 1854, to Margaret and James Winters of Deer Lodge, Montana Territory. Orphaned at age 3 following the deaths of both parents in a typhoid epidemic. Adopted by Thomas and Mary McKinnon of Copper Creek on September 10, 1857. The papers fell from Caleb's nerveless fingers as the implications crashed over him like an avalanche. Sarah wasn't his sister. She had never been his sister. The little girl he remembered joining their family when he was 7 years old hadn't been a sister found, but a sister chosen, an orphaned child his parents had taken in and loved as their own, so completely that even the children had never known the difference. "You didn't know," Sarah said, and it wasn't a question. She was watching his face with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every expression, every flicker of emotion that crossed his features. "No," Caleb managed, his voice hoarse with shock. They never told us. I thought you were, I always believed." "So did I," Sarah said softly. "Until Ma got sick that last winter. She was delirious with fever, and she kept apologizing for not telling me the truth about my parents. I thought it was just the sickness talking, but she mentioned these papers, hidden in the book. I looked for them after the funeral, but I was so young, and there was so much grief, I convinced myself I had misunderstood." Caleb stared at the scattered documents, his mind reeling as it tried to reconstruct 27 years of memories in light of this revelation. Every assumption he had made about their relationship, every moment of guilt and self-recrimination over his growing feelings for Sarah, every agonizing internal battle over the morality of their love, all of it based on a falsehood he had never thought to question. "Why didn't you remember these papers before now?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Sarah's smile was sad and understanding. "Because I didn't want to remember. When you left for the war, when I thought I might never see you again, it was easier to push away anything that might give me false hope. And then, when we were forced into this marriage, when we started—" She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "When we started developing feelings for each other, I was so convinced it was wrong that I couldn't let myself think about the possibility that it might not be." Caleb gathered up the adoption papers with hands that were steadier now, though his heart was still racing with the enormity of what they meant. Not just that their love was permissible, that would have been enough, but that it had always been permissible. Every night they had lain awake wrestling with guilt, every moment of self-denial, every whispered apology for feelings they couldn't control had been unnecessary. "We've been torturing ourselves for nothing," he said, the words coming out flat and strange as he tried to process the mixture of relief and regret that was flooding through him. "Not for nothing," Sarah corrected, moving closer to him on the cabin floor until she could place her hand over his heart. "We've been loving each other despite believing it was impossible. That means something, Caleb. That means everything." She was right, he realized. The revelation didn't diminish what they had built together. If anything, it made their connection more remarkable. They had chosen each other, despite believing that choice came with terrible moral costs. They had been willing to sacrifice their own peace of mind, their standing in the community, even their salvation in the next world, all for the sake of a love they believed was forbidden. All those nights, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion, all those times we pulled apart because we thought we were betraying everything we'd been taught. We were being true to our hearts, Sarah finished. Even when we thought our hearts were leading us astray, we followed them. That's not something to regret, Caleb. That's something to celebrate. The papers rustled in his hands as he set them carefully aside and drew Sarah into his arms. She came willingly, fitting against him with the perfect naturalness that had marked their relationship from the beginning. But now, there was something different in the way she melted against him, a relaxation of tension he hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. A loosening of some deep-held knot of anxiety. "Sarah Winters," he said, testing the sound of her birth name on his tongue. She laughed, the sound bright and free, in a way he hadn't heard since they were children. "It sounds strange, doesn't it? I've been Sarah McKinnon for so long that I'd forgotten I was ever anyone else. You'll always be Sarah to me," Caleb said, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "Sarah who taught me to find four-leaf clovers, Sarah who could outrun any boy in Copper Creek, Sarah who grew up to be the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." "And what does this change?" she asked, though the light in her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "Everything," Caleb said simply. "And nothing. We still love each other. We're still committed to building a life together. We still want the same future. But now—" He paused, struck by the magnitude of what he was about to say. "Now we can have it without shame. We can love each other openly, honestly, with nothing to hide from." Sarah's smile was radiant. "We can be married in truth, not just in legal necessity. We can have children," Caleb added, the words coming out in a rush as he realized the dreams he'd been afraid to acknowledge were now within reach. "We can build a real family with no secrets, no guilt, no fear of judgment." They spent the rest of that day reading through the adoption papers together, piecing together the story of Sarah's origins and the generosity of Thomas and Mary McKinnon in taking in an orphaned child. The documents revealed small details that added depth to their understanding. How Sarah's birth parents had been well-educated people who had come west seeking opportunity. How their deaths had left her with no other family. How the McKinnons had legally adopted her with the same care and thoroughness they brought to everything else in their lives. "They loved you completely," Caleb said, as they read through character references and legal attestations. "From the moment you joined our family, they never saw you as anything other than their daughter." "Our parents were good people," Sarah agreed. "They gave me everything they gave you: love, security, a sense of belonging. They made me a McKinnon in every way that mattered." As evening fell and they prepared their simple supper, both of them kept touching the adoption papers as if they were talismans, physical proof that their love was not only acceptable, but had been blessed from the beginning by the people who mattered most to them. The documents represented more than legal permission. They represented validation, absolution, and the promise of a future they could embrace without reservation. That night, they made love with a freedom and joy that had been absent from their previous encounters, their bodies speaking a language of celebration rather than guilty pleasure. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath their quilts, Sarah traced lazy patterns on Caleb's chest while they planned the life they could now build without apology. "What do you want to do first?" she asked. "Now that we know the truth?" Caleb considered the question, his mind racing with possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours before. "I want to have a real wedding," he said finally. "Not Judge Blackwood's mockery, but a real ceremony where we exchange vows that mean something." Sarah's eyes filled with happy tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it. To everything we've been afraid to dream." Outside, the Montana winter continued its advance across the high country, but inside their cabin, two hearts that had finally found their freedom were already planning for spring. The wanted poster arrived with the first mail delivery of spring, carried up the mountain by old Pete Hendricks, who made the treacherous journey to Caleb's cabin twice a year to deliver news from the outside world and pick up any furs or goods that needed to make their way to market. The poster was folded inside a letter from the new territorial marshal, a man named Daniel Crawford, who had apparently taken a very different approach to justice than his predecessors. Judge Horace Blackwood's face stared out from the weathered paper with the kind of arrogant confidence that had marked all his interactions with the people whose lives he had destroyed. But the words printed beneath his likeness told a different story. Wanted for corruption, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. $500 reward. Caleb read the poster 3 times before the implications fully sank in. While Sarah stood beside him in the cabin doorway, her hand resting on his arm as Pete Hendricks filled them in on the details that the official notice couldn't capture. "Blackwood's finished," Pete said. Accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered him with the grateful appreciation of a man who had ridden hard through rough country. Marshal Crawford came in from Denver with a federal mandate to clean up the territorial courts, and Blackwood was his first target. Turns out half the Denver mining interests had been complaining to Washington about their investments disappearing into corrupt land grabs. What happened to him? Sarah asked, though there was no sympathy in her voice for the man who had nearly destroyed their lives. Fled to California, they say, with whatever money he could carry. Left behind a mess of forged documents and paid witnesses who were real quick to confess once they realized Blackwood wasn't coming back to protect them. Pete took a long sip of his coffee and shook his head. Amazing how fast rats abandon a sinking ship. Caleb studied the letter that had accompanied the poster, noting the official seal and the precise handwriting that suggested Marshal Crawford was a man who took his duties seriously. What does this mean for us? Well, Pete said, settling back in his chair with the air of a man who enjoyed being the bearer of interesting news. According to Marshal Crawford, every one of Blackwood's legal decisions is being reviewed. That includes marriages, property transfers, criminal sentences, the whole mess. He's asked me to tell anyone affected by Blackwood's rulings to come into town within the next month to get their legal situations sorted out. Sarah's grip on Caleb's arm tightened. The marriage that had saved her life but trapped them both in an impossible situation was suddenly open to question. They could be free of the legal bond that had been forced upon them, free to make their own choices about their future, without the shadow of Blackwood's corruption hanging over them. But freedom, Caleb realized, came with its own complications. There's more, Pete continued, pulling another document from his saddlebags. The charges against you, Miss Sarah, have been officially dropped. Marshal Crawford found evidence that all the witnesses against you were paid by Blackwood, and Mrs. Patterson confessed to passing along information to her brother-in-law in exchange for having her own husband's gambling debts forgiven. Sarah's knees gave out slightly, and Caleb caught her, guiding her to a chair as the magnitude of Pete's news settled over them both. After months of living as fugitives from a justice system that had been corrupted beyond recognition, they were suddenly faced with the possibility of returning to normal life. So Sarah's free, Caleb said, processing the implications. The charges are dropped, Blackwood's gone, and we can dissolve the marriage if we choose to, Pete nodded, though he was watching them both with shrewd eyes that suggested he had picked up on the undercurrents in their conversation. That's about the size of it. Marshal Crawford's set up temporary offices in Copper Creek, and he's got authority to handle all the legal mess Blackwood left behind. After Pete left, promising to return in 2 days to guide them down to town if they decided to make the journey, Caleb and Sarah sat in their cabin and tried to process what this unexpected development meant for their future. The discovery of Sarah's adoption papers had freed them from the moral constraints they had believed governed their relationship. But this news from the outside world presented them with an entirely different set of choices. We could start over, Sarah said quietly, staring at the wanted poster that lay on the table between them. Clean slate, new beginning, no connection to any of this mess. Is that what you want? Caleb asked, though he dreaded the answer. The months they had spent together, especially the weeks since discovering the truth about Sarah's origins, had been the happiest of his adult life. The thought of returning to the isolation and loneliness that had defined his existence before Sarah arrived filled him with a hollow ache. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving around the small cabin that had become their sanctuary. "I want you," she said finally, her voice steady and sure. "I want us. But I also want—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I want us to have a real life, Caleb. Not just survival, but connection to the world, to other people, to all the possibilities we've been cut off from up here." Caleb understood what she meant. The mountains had provided them with refuge and the space to discover their love for each other, but they had also imposed a kind of exile. Sarah was a social creature by nature, someone who thrived on human connection and community involvement. The isolated life they had been living was necessary, but it wasn't sustainable in the long term. "You want to go back to town," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I want us to go back to town," Sarah corrected. "Together, as husband and wife by choice instead of by legal coercion." The distinction mattered, Caleb realized. Everything about their relationship had been shaped by external forces. Blackwood's corruption, Sarah's false charges, the desperate bargain that had brought them together. Now, for the first time, they had the opportunity to choose each other freely, without the weight of necessity or the shadow of moral uncertainty. But the prospect of returning to civilization also brought its own anxieties. How would the people of Copper Creek react to their relationship? Would they be seen as victims of Blackwood's manipulation or as something more scandalous? The truth about Sarah's adoption might satisfy legal and moral objections, but gossip and judgment followed their own logic. "Are you ready for that?" Caleb asked. "For the questions, the stares, the whispers." Sarah's smile was fierce and confident. "Let them whisper. We know the truth about who we are and how we came to love each other. Anyone who wants to judge us for choosing happiness over their narrow expectations can go to hell." The vehemence in her voice surprised him, but it also filled him with pride. The frightened woman who had arrived at his cabin months earlier had been transformed by their experiences together into someone who knew her own worth and refused to be diminished by other people's opinions. "Besides," Sarah added, her expression softening, "I'm tired of hiding, tired of feeling like our love is something shameful that has to be kept secret. I want to walk down Main Street holding your hand. I want to introduce you as my husband and mean it with my whole heart." That afternoon, they began making preparations for the journey to Copper Creek. Caleb cleaned and oiled his father's rifle, checked their supplies, and planned the route that would take them safely down from the mountains. Sarah packed their few belongings and gathered the adoption papers and other documents they would need to present to Marshal Crawford. As they worked, they talked about their plans for the future, dreams they had been afraid to voice when their situation seemed so precarious. Sarah spoke of reopening her bakery, of creating a gathering place where people could come for good food and friendly conversation. Caleb found himself imagining a life where his wilderness skills could be put to use guiding hunting parties or helping newcomers establish homesteads. Work that would keep him connected to the mountains while allowing him to be part of a community. "We could buy land," Sarah said as they shared their evening meal. "Build a proper house, maybe start a family." The casual mention of children made Caleb's heart skip. It was something they had discussed tentatively since discovering the adoption papers, but always as a distant possibility. Now, with legal freedom within their grasp, the dream seemed tantalizingly real. "How many?" he asked, and Sarah laughed at the eagerness in his voice. "Let's start with one and see how we manage," she said, though her eyes were bright with the same longing he felt. That night, they made love with a desperate tenderness, both of them aware that they stood on the threshold of a new chapter in their lives. Tomorrow they would begin the journey back to the world they had left behind, carrying with them the love they had discovered in isolation and the hope that it would prove strong enough to withstand the challenges that awaited them. As Sarah slept in his arms, Caleb found himself studying her face in the firelight. memorizing the peaceful expression that had replaced the haunted look she had worn when she first arrived at his cabin. Whatever happened when they returned to civilization, whatever judgments or obstacles they faced, he was certain of one thing: they had been forged into something stronger than either of them had been alone. The mountains had taught them that survival sometimes required impossible choices. But they had also learned that love, real, honest, uncompromising love, could transform even the most desperate circumstances into something beautiful. Tomorrow they would find out if that transformation was strong enough to survive in the bright, unforgiving light of the outside world. The church bell of Copper Creek had been cast in Philadelphia 15 years earlier, a gift from the mining company that had founded the town as a supply depot for their operations in the surrounding hills. Its bronze voice carried clearly across the valley as Caleb and Sarah rode down Main Street, announcing to the entire community that Sunday services would begin in 1 hour. But it wasn't Sunday, and the bell's unexpected tolling drew people from their shops and homes to see what warranted such attention. By the time Caleb and Sarah reached the center of town, a small crowd had gathered around the territorial office building where Marshal Crawford had established his temporary court. Sarah sat straight in her saddle, her chin raised and her eyes forward, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. The months of isolation in the mountains had changed her in ways that went beyond the sun-weathered complexion and the practical clothes that marked her as someone accustomed to hard living. There was strength in the set of her shoulders, determination in the line of her jaw, and something indefinable in her eyes that spoke of a woman who had been tested and had not been found wanting. Caleb rode beside her, close enough that their horses' shoulders touched, a subtle declaration of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by the watching townspeople. He wore his father's gun openly on his hip, not as a threat, but as a reminder that he was still the same man who had ridden into town months earlier, willing to do whatever it took to protect the woman he loved. Sarah McKinnon, called Mrs. Patterson, from the boardwalk in front of the general store, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I heard tell you were dead." Sarah turned in her saddle to face the woman whose gossip had nearly cost her life, her expression calm but unforgiving. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Mrs. Patterson, though no thanks to you." The older woman had the grace to look ashamed, her eyes dropping to the ground as color rose in her cheeks. Word of her confession to Marshal Crawford had apparently spread through the small community, and her standing among the townspeople had suffered accordingly. Marshal Crawford emerged from the territorial office as they dismounted, a tall, lean man with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little. His badge was polished but worn, and his handshake when Caleb offered it was firm and direct. "Mr. McKinnon, Mrs. McKinnon," he said, his voice carrying a slight Missouri accent. "I'm glad you decided to come in. We have quite a few things to discuss." The interior of the territorial office had been transformed since Sarah's imprisonment there months earlier. Gone were the oppressive decorations and intimidating furniture that had marked Judge Blackwood's tenure. In their place, Crawford had installed a simple desk, practical chairs, and filing cabinets that spoke of a man more interested in function than form. "First things first," Crawford said, settling behind his desk and opening a thick folder that contained what appeared to be dozens of documents. "Miss Winters, I'm sorry, Mrs. McKinnon. I want to formally apologize for the injustice you suffered under Judge Blackwood's administration. The charges against you were fabricated, the evidence was manufactured, and the witnesses were paid to lie. You have my word that nothing like this will happen again under my watch." Sarah nodded her acceptance of the apology, though her expression remained guarded. "What does that mean for our situation?" "It means you're free," Crawford said simply. "All charges dropped, all legal consequences voided. More than that, the territorial government is prepared to offer compensation for your illegal imprisonment and the suffering you endured." The offer of compensation was unexpected, And Caleb saw Sarah's eyes widen slightly at the implication. They had come to town expecting to clear their legal situation, not to receive payment for their troubles. As for your marriage, Crawford continued, his gaze moving between them with professional assessment, that's a more complicated matter. Judge Blackwood had no legal authority to force you into marriage, which means the union was invalid from the beginning. However, he held up a hand as both Caleb and Sarah started to speak. If you choose to remain married, I have the authority to perform a legitimate ceremony that will make your union legal and binding under territorial law. Sarah's hand found Caleb's, their fingers intertwining as they absorbed what the marshal was telling them. They had expected to face questions about the unusual circumstances of their marriage, but Crawford's matter-of-fact approach suggested that their situation, while uncommon, wasn't entirely unprecedented in his experience. There is one matter we should address, Crawford said, his tone becoming slightly more formal. I've reviewed the circumstances of your original marriage, and I understand there were concerns about the familial relationship between you. However, I've also had the opportunity to examine the adoption records that were filed when Sarah joined the McKinnon family. He pulled a document from his folder, a copy of the adoption papers they had discovered in Sarah's book of poetry. According to these records, there is no blood relationship between you. Sarah Elizabeth Winters was legally adopted by Thomas and Mary McKinnon, making her their daughter by law, but not by birth. This removes any legal impediment to your marriage. The relief that washed over both of them was palpable. Even though they had known the truth for months, hearing it confirmed by a federal marshal in an official capacity felt like the final lifting of a weight they had carried since childhood. So we can be legally married? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. If that's what you want, Crawford confirmed. I should warn you, though, that there will likely be talk. Small communities have long memories, and some people may choose to focus on how you were raised rather than the legal facts of your situation. Caleb squeezed Sarah's hand, drawing strength from her presence beside him. Let them talk, he said, echoing the words she had spoken in their mountain cabin. We know who we are to each other. Crawford smiled for the first time since they had entered his office, the expression transforming his austere features and revealing the human warmth beneath his professional demeanor. That's exactly the right attitude, Mr. McKinnon. In my experience, love that can survive the kind of trials you've been through doesn't need anyone else's approval to thrive. The ceremony that followed was simple, but profoundly meaningful. Crawford's assistant served as witness, while the marshal himself performed the brief ritual that would make their union legal in the eyes of territorial law. When they exchanged vows, words they had written themselves during the long winter evenings in their cabin, their voices carried the weight of everything they had survived together. I take you not because I have to, Sarah said, her eyes locked on Caleb's face, but because I choose to. Because you are the home my heart has been seeking all my life. I take you not to save you, Caleb replied, but to love you. Because you saved me first, in ways I didn't even know I needed. When Crawford pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed not only by the marshal and his assistant, but by several townspeople who had gathered outside the office windows, drawn by curiosity and perhaps by the recognition that they were witnessing something significant. As they emerged from the office, now legally married by choice rather than coercion, they were greeted by a scene that surprised them both. Instead of the hostility or judgment they had feared, they found faces marked by curiosity, sympathy, and in some cases, genuine warmth. Mrs. Carmichael from the boarding house stepped forward first, her weathered hands reaching out to clasp Sarah's. "My dear," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm so glad to see you safe and well. When we heard what Blackwood had done, well, I'm just grateful it's all worked out." Others followed her example, offering congratulations that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. It became clear that the story of their forced marriage and subsequent survival had spread through the community, transformed by repetition and time into something approaching legend. They were seen not as a scandal, but as victims of corruption who had found love despite impossible circumstances. The new land deed was written on crisp parchment with official seals that caught the afternoon light, streaming through the windows of the territorial office. The property it described was a modest plot on the eastern edge of Copper Creek, 2 acres of level ground with good water access and room for both a house and the bakery that Sarah dreamed of. Reopening, Caleb studied the document with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust legal papers after their experiences with Judge Blackwood. But Marshal Crawford's reputation for honest dealing had preceded him to Montana territory, and the terms of the sale were straightforward and fair. The previous owner defaulted on payments to the bank after Blackwood seized his mining claim on false charges, Crawford explained. The territorial government has decided to offer these recovered properties to citizens who were harmed by the former judge's corruption, at cost rather than fair market value. Sarah ran her fingers over the deed, tracing the careful script that described boundaries and water rights with the precision that only legal documents seemed to require. "It's really ours? As soon as you sign here," Crawford confirmed, indicating the signature line at the bottom of the page. The act of signing felt momentous, the pen heavy in Sarah's hand as she wrote her name with careful deliberation. Sarah McKinnon. Not Winters, not the frightened woman who had been dragged from her boarding house months earlier, but the person she had chosen to become through love and adversity. Caleb signed beside her, his signature bold and confident, claiming not just the property, but their right to build a life together in full view of the community that had once seemed ready to condemn them both. As they prepared to leave the marshal's office with their precious deed safely tucked away, they were interrupted by a commotion from the street outside. Raised voices and the sound of horses moving fast suggested trouble, and Crawford immediately moved toward the window to investigate. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, then glanced apologetically at Sarah. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but it looks like we have some unexpected visitors." Through the window, they could see 3 men dismounting from lathered horses in front of the saloon across the street. Even from a distance, it was clear that these weren't local residents. Their clothes were too fine, their horses too expensive, and their movements carried the particular arrogance that came with money and power. "Friends of Judge Blackwood?" Caleb asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. "More likely creditors," Crawford replied grimly. "Or business partners who aren't happy about having their investments disrupted by my investigation into the judge's activities." The truth became apparent quickly enough. The 3 men crossed the street with purposeful strides, and the leader, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers and expensive boots, pushed through the office door without bothering to knock. "Marshal Crawford," he demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "I'm Harrison Wade from the Colorado Mining Consortium. We need to discuss the illegal seizure of our lawfully purchased properties." Crawford's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he had been expecting this confrontation. "Mr. Wade, I was wondering when you'd arrive. Please have a seat. I'll stand," Wade replied curtly, his attention shifting to Caleb and Sarah with obvious distaste. "Are these the people you've been giving away our land to?" "This is Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon," Crawford said calmly, "and the land in question was never legally yours to begin with. Judge Blackwood had no authority to sell property he had seized through fraudulent legal proceedings." Wade's face darkened with anger. "We have bills of sale, signed contracts, territorial approval for our mining operations. If you think a few disgruntled locals can overturn legitimate business transactions—" "Legitimate?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through Wade's bluster with surprising strength. "You call it legitimate when a corrupt judge murders innocent people to steal their land? When he forces women into marriages to keep them quiet about his crimes?" Wade's eyes narrowed as he looked more closely at Sarah, recognition dawning on his features. "You're the woman who was spreading lies about Judge Blackwood's business dealings. The one who was supposed to hang. The casual way he spoke about her near execution sent a chill through the room. It was clear that Wade and his associates had been fully aware of Blackwood's methods and had profited from them without concern for the human cost. The only lies, Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet, were the ones your judge told to steal other people's property. Wade's hand moved toward his coat, but Crawford's voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't if I were you. You're in my jurisdiction now, Mr. Wade, and I take a dim view of threats against territorial citizens. This isn't over, Wade snarled, but he backed toward the door. We have lawyers, political connections, investors who won't stand for this kind of interference with their rights. Then tell them to take it up with the federal government in Denver, Crawford replied evenly. Because that's where this investigation originated, and that's where it will be resolved. After Wade and his companions left, their departure marked by the thunder of hoofbeats and muttered threats. The office fell quiet except for the sound of Crawford's pen scratching across official forms. Will there be trouble? Sarah asked, though she was proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear Wade's visit had awakened. There's always trouble when money and corruption get mixed together, Crawford admitted. But Wade and his people are operating outside the law now. They have no legal standing and they know it. The bluster and threats are all they have left. Caleb's arm slipped around Sarah's waist, pulling her closer to his side in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. We're not running anymore, he said firmly. We have the law on our side now and we have each other. That's enough. Crawford smiled at the determination in both their voices. Yes, he said, sealing the last of their legal documents with his official stamp. I believe it is. The wedding rings were simple gold bands, crafted by the local blacksmith from nuggets Caleb had found in the stream that ran through their new property. They exchanged them beside that same stream, on a morning when the aspen trees were showing their first hints of autumn gold, with only the mountains and the rushing water as witnesses to their private ceremony. With this ring, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of the water, I give you my heart, my future, and my promise to love you for all the days of our lives. Caleb's hands were steady as he slipped the ring onto her finger, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. With this ring, he replied, I give you everything I am and everything I hope to become, freely chosen and freely given. 6 months had passed since their confrontation with Harrison Wade and his associates in Marshall Crawford's office. The mining consortium had indeed brought lawyers and political pressure to bear, but the federal investigation into territorial corruption had proven too thorough and too well documented for their protests to carry weight. Wade's threats had eventually faded into legal wrangling that would likely continue for years but posed no immediate danger to the life Caleb and Sarah were building together. Their house stood on a small rise overlooking the stream, its solid log walls and stone chimney speaking of permanence and the intention to stay. Sarah's bakery occupied the ground floor of a separate building closer to the road, its windows bright with cheerful curtains and its shelves lined with the bread, pies, and pastries that had quickly made it the social center of Copper Creek. The community's acceptance hadn't happened overnight, but it had happened more easily than either of them had dared to hope. Their story, the forced marriage that had become true love, the survival against impossible odds, the revelation that had freed them from moral constraints, had captured the imagination of people who understood that life on the frontier required unconventional solutions to impossible problems. Mrs. McKinnon called Alice Crawford, the marshal's wife, as she approached the couple by the stream with a covered basket in her hands. She had become Sarah's closest friend in town, a woman of warm heart and practical wisdom who understood the value of loyalty tested by adversity. I brought some of those apples you wanted for the harvest pies. Thank you, Sarah said, accepting the basket with genuine gratitude. The harvest celebration was still 2 weeks away, but preparation for the community's largest social gathering of the year required considerable advance planning. Alice's smile was knowing as she glanced at the rings on both their fingers. Private ceremony? We wanted something that was just ours, Caleb explained, his arms circling Sarah's waist in a gesture that had become natural as breathing. Something that belonged to us rather than to the expectations of other people. I understand completely, Alice said. Sometimes the most meaningful promises are the ones we make away from crowds and ceremonies. After Alice left, Caleb and Sarah walked hand in hand along the stream bank, following a path they had worn smooth through daily walks that had become their favorite way to end each day. The water sang over smooth stones, carrying with it the voices of the high country they had left behind, but not forgotten. Do you miss it? Sarah asked, reading his thoughts with the intuitive understanding that had developed between them over months of shared experiences. The cabin, the solitude, the mountains? Caleb considered the question, his gaze moving from the stream to the town visible in the distance, then to the woman beside him whose presence had transformed his understanding of what home could mean. I miss the simplicity sometimes, he admitted, but I don't miss the loneliness. And I've discovered that happiness shared is better than peace in isolation. Sarah squeezed his hand, her engagement ring catching the late afternoon light. The ring was new, but the calluses on her palms spoke of months of hard work, building their business and their life together. I never thought I could be this happy, she said quietly. Even in my most optimistic moments, I never imagined feeling this, complete. They had reached the place where the stream curved around a stand of cottonwoods, creating a natural bower that offered privacy from the road and the town beyond. It was here that Caleb often found Sarah in the early mornings, reading her mother's book of poetry or simply sitting in quiet contemplation of the life they were creating together. There's something I need to tell you, Sarah said, her tone carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made Caleb's pulse quicken. He turned to face her fully, noting the particular glow in her cheeks and the brightness in her eyes that seemed to have intensified over the past few weeks. What is it? Sarah's smile was radiant as she placed his hand over her still flat stomach. I'm carrying our child. Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday when I went to town for supplies. The news hit Caleb like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and making his knees weak with the magnitude of what she was telling him. A child, their child. The dream they had discussed in whispered conversations was becoming reality faster than he had dared to hope. When, he managed, his voice hoarse with emotion. Early spring, the doctor thinks. April, maybe May. Sarah's hand covered his where it rested on her stomach. Are you happy? Happy seemed inadequate to describe the riot of emotions flooding through him, joy, pride, terror, and overwhelming love all battling for dominance in his chest. He stopped, searching for words that could encompass what he was feeling. I'm everything. Happy, scared, grateful, amazed, all of it. They held each other beside the stream as the sun set behind the mountains. Two people who had found their way to love through the most unlikely of circumstances and were now preparing to expand that love to include another life. The water continued its eternal song, carrying their dreams toward a future that seemed bright with possibility. 5 years later, their son Thomas played in the same stream while his younger sister Mary gathered wildflowers under their mother's watchful eye. Caleb stood in the doorway of their expanded house, watching his family with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had discovered that the greatest adventures were sometimes the quietest ones. The bakery thrived, the town had grown and prospered, and their love had deepened with each passing season. They had proven that sometimes the most impossible circumstances could lead to the most extraordinary happiness, and that love freely chosen was always stronger than love compelled by necessity. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanged, keeping their secrets and blessing those brave enough to seek their fortunes in the shadow of their peaks. And in the valley below, two hearts that had found each other against all odds continued to beat in perfect rhythm, creating the music of a life well lived and fully shared.